The first thing she noticed was the weight, not on her body, above it, a canopy, heavy cream silk draped in soft folds, embroidered with golden vines that caught the morning light. The fabric swayed faintly, though no breeze touched her skin. She blinked once, twice. The ceiling beyond the canopy was painted angels and clouds and a distant battlefield framed in carved molding. She did not own molding. Her apartment ceiling had a faint crack that spread like a spiderweb near the corner. She pushed herself up. The mattress dipped differently than memory allowed, too soft, too wide. She tried to swing her legs off the bed and stand. Her body didn't cooperate. The moment her feet touched the floor, her balance misaligned. Her muscles moved, but not in the rhythm her mind expected. It was as if her brain sent commands meant for a different frame. Her knee buckled. She stumbled forward and caught herself on the edge of the bed before she could fully fall. For several long seconds she remained there, breathing hard, fingers gripping silk sheets. Her muscle memory did not match her thoughts. The length of her limbs, the shift in posture, the way her weight distributed across her hips and spine. This was not the body she had lived in yesterday. She tried again slowly this time, carefully. One step, adjust, another. It took nearly half a minute before the disorientation faded and her movements began to sync with her mind. Only then did she notice her voice. "This is a dream," she muttered. It did not sound like hers. Clearer, lower, composed. She froze. Very slowly she lifted her hand into view. The fingers were long, elegant, nails perfectly shaped and tinted a soft rose. No chipped polish, no faint ink stain on the side of her middle finger. She turned her wrist. No watch, no faint scar from burning herself on a kettle years ago. A knock came at the door. 3 precise taps. "My lady," a woman's voice called gently through the wood. "It is nearly noon. The seamstress is waiting." "My lady." The air in her lungs thinned. Seamstress. Nearly noon. Her gaze shifted slowly across the room. The carved wardrobe with gilded handles. The tall standing mirror framed in ivory-painted wood. The balcony doors draped in pale curtains. The writing desk positioned deliberately beside the eastern window. She had read this room before. Not seen it. Read it. No, she whispered. Her eyes moved to the mirror. She approached it carefully now, as though sudden movement might crack whatever illusion she was trapped in. The woman staring back at her was devastatingly beautiful. Long dark hair spilled over one shoulder in soft waves. Skin pale but luminous. High cheekbones. A sharp jawline. Lips shaped in a way that looked permanently unimpressed. And the eyes, though silver gray, intelligent, detached. Recognition struck without mercy. Lady Seraphina Valmont. The name felt like a verdict. The most infamous villainess in the novel she had rage-read late into the night weeks ago. Petty, jealous, arrogant, publicly humiliates the heroine at the spring banquet. Socially destroyed within days. Exiled within months. Executed quietly in the north after being framed for treason. Her stomach turned cold. Another knock. "My lady." She forced herself to breathe. Think, when was this in the timeline? Her gaze snapped to the writing desk. An envelope lay atop it, sealed in red wax and stamped with the royal crest. Her fingers moved before she could hesitate. She broke the seal. The parchment trembled slightly in her hands. Spring banquet. Tonight. Her heart dropped. 3 days before the infamous humiliation scene. 3 days before she begins her public downfall. Memories from the novel surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. The heroine arrives in pale blue silk. The crown prince cannot look away. Seraphina, burning with jealousy, spills wine and delivers cutting remarks. Laughter spreads. Reputations shift. Alliances begin to fracture. The Duke watches silently. The cold Duke of the North. He had not been the novel's male lead, but he had been the only man who never laughed when Seraphina fell. He had simply watched, measured, unmoved. Another knock, firmer this time. "My lady, we must prepare." The banquet. The script was already written. Her downfall was scheduled. She lifted her gaze back to the mirror. Seraphina had died because she reacted emotionally, because she let jealousy dictate her actions, because she played the role expected of her. Slowly she straightened. If she was trapped inside this story, she would not follow it. "I won't insult anyone," she murmured to her reflection. Her voice sounded composed. "Noble, dangerous. And I certainly won't beg for a man who isn't worth it." Footsteps shifted outside the door. The world was moving. She walked toward it. Her fingers curled round the handle. The metal was cool, solid, real. She opened the door and stepped into the life of a villainess who was not going to die quietly. She opened the door. Two maids stood waiting in the corridor, dressed in muted gray uniforms trimmed with silver thread. Both lowered their heads at once, posture precise and restrained. "My lady," one of them said, "the bath has been prepared." Their eyes did not meet hers. The corridor stretched wide and polished, marble floors reflecting tall windows that spilled afternoon light across painted walls. Portraits of Valmont ancestors lined the passage, each face composed in aristocratic severity. Her slippers made almost no sound as she stepped forward. The door closed behind her with a soft click that felt far more final than it should have. This estate belonged to Seraphina Valmont, one of the wealthiest noble families in the empire, and yet walking through it felt like trespassing inside someone else's legacy. "Has the carriage been ordered?" she asked. "Yes, my lady," the taller maid answered. "It will arrive at the 8th bell." She nodded once. In the novel, Seraphina had thrown a brush at a maid that same morning for choosing the wrong ribbon. That memory lingered unpleasantly in her mind, not because she had lived it, but because the narrative had described it so casually. They turned down another corridor toward the bathing chamber. As she walked, the timeline arranged itself more clearly in her thoughts. The spring banquet marked the beginning of Seraphina's visible decline. Until tonight, her sharp temper had been tolerated. Her engagement to the Crown Prince shielded her from consequence. Her family's wealth discouraged open criticism. But the banquet changed the balance. Lady Eveline Laurent would make her formal return to high society this evening. The novel had described her relentlessly pale blue silk embroidered with silver lilies, soft laughter, the kind of beauty that disarmed hostility before it formed. She had grown up away from court politics, raised quietly in the countryside, and that simplicity only increased her appeal. At the banquet the Crown Prince would offer her the first dance. That moment would be small on the surface. It would not seem like a declaration, but the court would notice. And Seraphina, wounded by pride, would react. She would deliver a cutting remark disguised as humor. She would spill wine in a gesture too deliberate to be accidental. Laughter would ripple through the hall, some hesitant, some eager. The damage would begin there. Invitations would thin. The Crown Prince's patience would cool. The temple would gradually favor Eveline in public ceremonies. Political support would shift quietly behind closed doors. Months later, when a failed grain shipment in the north required someone to blame, Seraphina's tarnished reputation would make her expendable. Exile would follow, then execution. Not dramatic, not heroic. A quiet removal from relevance. They reached the bathing chamber doors. Steam drifted faintly through the opening. She paused and turned slightly toward the maids. "Tell me," she said evenly, "what rumors circulate about tonight?" The taller maid answered after a brief pause. "There is excitement regarding Lady Eveline's return, my lady, and the Crown Prince." The shorter maid replied quietly, "It is said His Highness intends to offer the first dance to Lady Eveline." There it was. The spark that would have ignited Seraphina's pride. She felt the echo of that pride stir somewhere beneath her ribs, sharp and possessive, but it did not belong to her. It felt more like residue than emotion. Jealousy would not protect her. Even if she remained perfectly polite tonight, the larger structure of the story would still unfold. Eveline would continue gaining influence. The Crown Prince would drift regardless. The temple would adjust its alliances. Avoiding humiliation would only delay collapse. She stepped inside the bathing chamber, dismissing the maids with a quiet motion of her hand. The door closed softly behind her, sealing her in warmth and faint rose-scented steam. Sunlight filtered through frosted glass, turning the air pale gold. She rested her hands against the cool edge of the marble basin and lowered her gaze. Survival required more than restraint. It required leverage. In the novel, the true power in the empire did not rest solely with the Crown Prince. It rested with the North. The Duke commanded the border armies. Trade routes flowed through his lands of grain, iron, timber. When he spoke in council, decisions shifted. When he remained silent, others hesitated. He had never been captivated by Eveline's beauty. He had been captivated by competence. That detail had seemed minor when she first read the story. Now it felt like the only useful truth. If Seraphina had fallen because she relied on status and temper, then she would rely on something else entirely. Strategy, knowledge, understanding systems this world had never modernized. She lifted her head slowly, meeting her reflection in the polished marble. "I won't play the jealous fiancée," she murmured. The steam curled quietly around her shoulders. "If this world insists on politics," she continued softly, "then I'll give it politics. Tonight would not be about competing for attention. It would be reconnaissance." Outside, she could hear the estate shifting toward evening preparations, the distant movement of servants, the faint rumble of wheels somewhere in the courtyard. The banquet was no longer a stage for humiliation. It was a board, and she intended to make her first move carefully. The banquet was no longer a stage for humiliation. It was a board, and she intended to make her first move carefully. A soft knock sounded at the bathing chamber door. "My lady, the seamstress has arrived," a maid announced from outside. "Send her in," Seraphina replied evenly. When the door opened, three women entered, each carrying garments draped carefully over padded wooden arms. They moved with the restrained efficiency of people accustomed to working under scrutiny. No one spoke unless necessary. Folds of silk shimmered in layered shades crimson, emerald, royal violet, gold-threaded black. The fabrics were rich, commanding, designed to dominate attention the moment she stepped into a room. In the novel, Seraphina had chosen scarlet. Scarlet signaled challenge. Scarlet signaled possession. Scarlet announced that she intended to stand beside the Crown Prince and remind the court exactly who held the title of fiancée. She studied the gowns without touching them. "Lay them out," Seraphina instructed calmly. The seamstresses arranged the garments across a long cushioned bench. The colors caught the light differently, some gleaming boldly, others heavy with embroidery that demanded admiration. "My lady, the crimson silk would complement your complexion beautifully this evening," the head seamstress said carefully. Of course it would. It was predictable. Predictable choices were easy to frame. Seraphina stepped past the crimson without pause. Her fingers brushed a darker fabric midnight blue, nearly black, unless light struck it directly. Silver thread traced subtle geometric patterns through the silk, precise rather than ornamental, not romantic, not delicate, controlled. She lifted the gown slightly, testing its weight and fall. "Has this been worn before?" Seraphina asked. "No, my lady," the head seamstress replied quickly. "It was prepared for winter court, but never selected." Seraphina glanced toward the mirror. Scarlet would declare rivalry. Midnight blue would declare restraint. In a court expecting jealousy, restraint would be far more disruptive than spectacle. This one Seraphina decided. The seamstress hesitated before speaking again. "My lady, it is less vibrant than what you usually prefer." "Then tonight will be unusual," Seraphina replied. The room fell silent. As they helped her dress, she noticed the careful distance in their movements. Hands adjusted fabric with measured caution. Pins were placed with delicate precision. Even when fastening the bodice, they avoided brushing her skin longer than necessary. Reputation here was not abstract. It lived in the tension of a servant's shoulders, in the way they inhaled before speaking. She allowed her hair to be styled lower than before, dark waves gathered neatly at the nape of her neck rather than braided high in an elaborate crown. She declined the jeweled headpiece Seraphina had favored in the novel. When the jewelry case was opened, rubies glittered inside. "My lady, shall we prepare the ruby necklace?" a maid asked. "No," Seraphina answered. "Pearls." "The small strand, my lady," the maid clarified. Yes, pearls rested at her collarbone with quiet composure. They did not compete for attention. They suggested stability rather than spectacle. When the seamstresses stepped back, Seraphina faced the mirror fully. Midnight blue silk traced her figure without exaggeration. Silver embroidery revealed itself only when she moved. The pearls framed her throat like restrained punctuation. She did not look softer. She looked deliberate, not a jealous fiancée, a woman who observed before she acted. A footman appeared at the doorway and bowed deeply. "My lady, the carriage awaits." "Very well," Seraphina replied. She walked through the corridor once more, servants lowering their heads as she passed. This time she noticed something subtle in their expressions. Confusion. They had prepared for temper. They expected spectacle. Instead, they received silence. Outside, late afternoon light cast gold across the courtyard. The Valmont carriage waited at the steps, polished blackwood gleaming beneath the family crest engraved in silver. A footman extended his hand. She accepted it without hesitation and stepped inside. As the carriage door closed and the wheels began to turn, she felt something steady settle within her chest. Not fear, not envy, anticipation. Tonight the court would expect a Villainess. She intended to give them a strategist. Tonight the court would expect a Villainess. She intended to give them a strategist. The carriage moved steadily toward the palace. Seraphina sat upright, hands folded neatly in her lap. Through the window the capital shifted from busy merchant streets to the broader avenues of the noble district. Carriages bearing family crests rolled in the same direction, all converging toward the Palace Hill. The banquet was not merely a social gathering. It was a display of alignment. The Crown Prince held legitimacy. The Temple held influence over public sentiment. But the North held the army. She watched banners pass by the window and organized the empire in her mind the way she would arrange pieces on a board. The Crown Prince was admired, but admiration was fragile. It depended on perception. Eveline Laurent embodied everything that perception favored: beauty, gentleness, simplicity. The Duke of the North did not depend on admiration. He depended on supply lines, on disciplined soldiers, on border stability. In the novel he rarely spoke in court, but when he did, discussions ended quickly. He was not drawn to soft words or graceful smiles. He evaluated outcomes. That detail had once seemed minor. Now it felt decisive. The carriage slowed as the outer palace gates came into view. Guards stepped forward, halberds crossing briefly before lowering in recognition. "State your house," one of them called. "House Valmont," the driver answered. The guard bowed. "Proceed." The gates opened. Inside, the palace grounds were already alive with movement. Lanterns glowed along the curved drive. Carriages lined the approach. Servants hurried between arrivals with trained efficiency. Seraphina noticed another crest ahead. House Laurent. So Eveline had already arrived. Of course she had. The carriage came to a smooth stop at the base of the grand staircase. Music drifted faintly from within the palace strings tuning, conversation rising and falling in practised tones. A footman opened the door and extended his hand. "We have arrived, my lady." Seraphina stepped down onto the stone. The palace stood before her, columns rising high beneath the darkening sky. Nobles ascended the staircase in clusters, silk and jewels catching lantern light as they moved. This was the place where Seraphina Valmont had ruined herself. Same hall, same court, same watching eyes. The only difference was intent. She adjusted her gloves carefully. Then she began to climb. Each step carried her closer to the doors where the story expected her to fail. At the top of the staircase the grand entrance stood open. Light spilled outward. Voices blended into a polished hum. Inside, the court was already watching. Inside, the court was already watching. The grand hall opened wide beneath vaulted ceilings, chandeliers casting steady gold light over polished marble floors. Conversations overlapped in careful layers. Laughter rose and softened. Silk brushed against silk. The moment Seraphina crossed the threshold, the nearest cluster of nobles paused. Not openly. Just enough. She felt it without looking directly at them, the brief tightening of posture, the subtle redirection of attention. The Villainess had arrived. The court was waiting for spectacle. A herald's voice rang out from near the centre of the hall. "His Imperial Highness, Crown Prince Adrien Valcrest." The room shifted immediately. Heads turned. The Crown Prince entered with practised ease, dressed in white and gold formal attire, the imperial crest pinned at his shoulder. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to admiration and rarely denied it. At his side, pale blue silk, Lady Eveline Laurent. Even from a distance she was luminous. The fabric of her gown shimmered softly as she walked, embroidered with delicate silver lilies. Her blonde hair fell in gentle waves over her shoulders, a small diamond clasp catching the light. She did not move with arrogance nor with false modesty. She moved as though unaware of the effect she created, which made the effect stronger. A murmur passed through the hall. The Crown Prince leaned slightly toward her as he spoke. Eveline tilted her head in response, smiling genuine, not calculated. Seraphina watched the exchange without tightening her expression. In the novel, this had been the moment jealousy overtook her. In reality, it was simply information. The Crown Prince's attention was clear, but attention was not power. A noble woman standing near Seraphina leaned closer to her companion and whispered too loudly, "It seems His Highness has found new company this evening." Her companion replied under her breath, "Let us hope Lady Valmont does not take offence." Seraphina did not acknowledge them. Instead, she shifted her gaze beyond the centre of the hall, toward the periphery. He stood near one of the tall windows, slightly apart from the densest crowd. The Duke of the North. He wore dark formal uniform rather than ceremonial coloured deep charcoal trimmed in silver, the insignia of the Northern Legion fixed at his collar. No excessive jewels, no ornamental cape. The cut of the fabric alone spoke of precision. His posture was relaxed, but not careless. One hand rested loosely behind his back. The other held a glass he had not yet lifted to his lips. Unlike the others, he was not watching Eveline. He was watching the room, measuring who approached the crown prince, noting which nobles shifted position, tracking reactions. Strategic, detached. For a moment, Seraphina studied him without meaning to. As if sensing the scrutiny, his gaze moved. It did not search aimlessly. It landed. On her. There was no flicker of surprise in his expression, no disdain, no curiosity exaggerated for politeness. Only assessment. He took in the midnight blue gown, the restrained jewelry, the absence of theatrical anger. His eyes lingered half a second longer than courtesy required. Not admiration, evaluation. The weight of it was different from the crown prince's attention. Less flattering, more precise. Seraphina held his gaze. Not challengingly, not submissively. Steady. Across the hall, the crown prince laughed at something Eveline had said. Several nobles joined in. The sound carried easily. The duke did not look toward them. He continued looking at Seraphina, as though the deviation from expectation interested him more than beauty ever could. A courtier approached her cautiously and bowed. "Lady Valmont, may I say you look different." Seraphina supplied calmly. The man blinked. "Refined, my lady." "I shall accept refined," she replied. A faint murmur rippled outward again. Across the room, Eveline's gaze finally shifted. For the briefest moment their eyes met. Eveline's expression remained gentle, but something sharper flickered beneath it awareness. She knew the court expected rivalry. She knew Seraphina's reputation. She was waiting. Seraphina did nothing. She neither approached nor retreated. And in that stillness she felt it clearly. The narrative hesitated. The script had expected a reaction. Instead, there was restraint. Across the hall, the duke's mouth curved almost imperceptibly. Not a smile, an acknowledgment. The first move had not been loud, but it had been noticed. End of chapter 1.